Hey everybody, Jane here, and today I'm going to talk to you about Every Heart a Doorway. I'd heard a ton about this series, and I just finally read book 1, which is Every Heart a Doorway. I believe the series is called the Wayward Children series. And it is about a school for children who have passed through portal worlds and have returned. And particularly, we are following a character named Nancy, who is new to the school. And shortly after her arrival, a fellow student dies. And of course, since she is the new arrival, she is suspect, especially because it is common knowledge that the world that she went to was a little bit dark. So Nancy and a group of other students who believe her innocent are trying to figure out who killed the student, and also to make sure they stay safe and prevent further deaths. I gave this book a 4 out of 5. I really had a good time with it, though I'm wondering how I will feel about continuing the series, because the things I loved about this book are not things that I necessarily expect to continue in the stories as we go into the portals with different characters, which I believe is what a lot of the sequel books is. This book, Every Heart a Doorway, does not actually have anybody passing through portals. We don't see any portal worlds. It is just an introduction to these characters who have come out of portal worlds. So I did think that this was a very interesting story and an idea that's not really touched on very often. I remember reading the Narnia books growing up, and that was mentioned of the difficulty the 4 children had reintegrating into society because they had been kings and queens of Narnia, and now they're back and they're school children. They had been adults in positions of power. They had fought battles and done all these great things, and they were no longer the children that they were when they left. And that is something that I don't think we see a lot of depicted. Is this what happens when the kids do come back, and how do they adjust to life or not? So I really thought that this was a very interesting premise story-wise. I guessed who was killing people early on, and I kind of guessed the motive early on, but that didn't inhibit my enjoyment. I still had a good time with it. I did want to note that this book has a lot of diversity. There is a transgendered character and an asexual character. Nancy, the one we follow, is our asexual character. And then there is a boy who was assigned female at birth. He went through a portal world and learned that he was a boy, and then was kicked out of that portal world because the portal world didn't want a boy, it wanted a girl. So that was a really neat thing. I will say I was hoping that his portal world was one of the ones that was out, because I kind of would like to know more about his story. But so far it doesn't look like his story is present. And he was probably one of my favorite characters. My second favorite character, him and the other little boy, Chris, were tied for my favorite characters. I will say that this is a very female-centric book. We are told pretty early on, and I don't think this is a huge spoiler, that the number of females that go into portal worlds is much greater than the number of males. And because that is the case, the majority of the students at this school are female. And I just happen to find 2 of the boys the more interesting characters. I will say I didn't love the explanation we were given of why little boys don't tend to go to these portal worlds, but it's fine. I thought it was kind of, really? No. In my opinion, that's kind of a silly excuse, but okay. I'm just checking my notes here because I have several things I wanted to talk about. This book had really vibrant characters, and they were all very different. I will note for anybody who is picking this up, there is a little bit of vulgarity in a certain scene that it didn't upset me, but it surprised me. One of the characters, the stuff she says is a little bit on the vulgar side, and I know this is a young adult book, so I wasn't prepared. I was not prepared, so just go into it knowing that there's a little bit of vulgarity, and depending on where you stand on that, it might be a little bit offensive. Those were my major thoughts on the book. I did want to go into some of the themes in this book. Normally, I read books on the surface. I go in, I have a good time, but this book I felt was very much a metaphor for adolescence, which I think is why I related to it so much. Because I'm going to be going kind of in depth into some of the themes in this book, there will be minor spoilers. I'm not going to spoil who was murdered. I'm not going to spoil who the murderer ended up being, anything like that. So it will not be major spoilers, but there will be certain spoilers. So if you want to go into a book absolutely, completely blind, you may not want to continue here until you finish. Also, I'm going to be drawing a lot of parallels and comparisons to my own life/situation/adolescence and why I felt like this book really resonated with me, and I think it'll resonate with a lot of people. So this is kind of I read this book and thought, man, I want to write a paper on all of the metaphors for adolescence and growing up that I found in this and was really intrigued by. But I don't actually want to write a paper because I'm not in school and that seems like a lot of work. So I thought I would just share with you some of the things I noticed in the themes that really hit home with me, and probably part of the reason that I did enjoy this book so much. But as I said, there may be minor spoilers. So if you don't wish to continue, I'm going to go into a discussion on theme in 3, 2, 1. All right, so this book really resonated with me, and I think a big reason it resonated was because so much of it was very relatable to anybody who has gone through adolescence. There are 2 schools in this world, in North America. We are told they're all over the country, but in North America, there are 2 schools. There is one school for the people who went through the portal worlds and it was terrible, and they came back and they are just traumatized, and they just need to learn to forget and move on. And the other group are the people who they went through the portal world, felt like that's where they were supposed to be, and they are grieving the loss of that portal world. They want to go back. And some of them, they've been told your door may open again. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. We just don't know. So these students, in some cases, are trying to go back through their portals, to find their portal doors, to figure out how to go home. And that really resonated with me as kind of how there seem to be 2 camps of how people handle adolescence. You either seem to really hate it and be glad that you're past it, or you miss that part of your life and are very much in mourning for who you were as a teenager. My boyfriend and I are in very opposite camps here. He was very happy to grow up and move on, and he is so glad he's not a teenager anymore. I had a lot of difficult things happen as a teenager. However, I miss many aspects of who I was at that time in my life. I was very much a very optimistic person, a very romantic person, a very sunshine and roses and everything is going to be wonderful person. And I struggle with that a lot more now. I also had a lot of deep friendships in high school. And while I do have some deep friendships, I find adult friendships significantly more difficult than the friendships I had in high school. And I crave those friendships, but I just don't, they're not really feasible as an adult. My friends who are work friends, you keep while you are working at a place, but then when you work somewhere else, you tend to lose them. And similarly, your friends who you were friends with outside of, work, if they have kids, you're both busy. Getting together with the kids can be time consuming and difficult. Sometimes you can manage, sometimes you can't. Depends on your friendship, the age of your kids, so many things. So I really have very little social life, and I don't have the close knit spending time with my friends that I had as a teenager. And sometimes I miss that. Sometimes I miss that feeling of connectedness because I just don't have that as much as an adult. So I thought that having the two schools was kind of very symbolic of the two ways that people tend to process their adolescent years. Either, push it behind me, I just want to get past the trauma of being a teenager and move on to this great, amazing adulthood, or I'm really in mourning for who I was and certain aspects of my life as a teenager, and maybe that's something that's hard to get over. Another thing that I thought was thematic, again, of the changes of adolescence is these children who come back from the portal worlds are very changed. And a lot of times it makes it very difficult to adjust, and their parents and their relationships change, often to the point that their parents feel like they can't manage them. Their parents are like, you are not the child I had, and we want that child that we lost back. And I do think that this could be symbolic of so many things, not just a child who is growing up and their relationship with their parents changes. Their parents, you're no longer your parent's child. You are a grown person who is making mistakes, sometimes really rough and awful mistakes that your parents really hate. Your parents don't always like who you've become. For me, that is especially true. My parents were very conservative and religious when I was growing up, and when I decided I didn't want to be their religion anymore, they asked me to move out of their house. I was 18, I hadn't yet finished high school, but they didn't want me living there because they felt my lack of religion was a bad influence on my brother and sister. So for me, as I became a whole person, my relationship with them changed, and they basically at one point were like, you are not who we want you to be, who we thought you were, who we know you as, and if you can't be that person, we don't want you here. And definitely the boy who was assigned female at birth, he definitely has that. His parents only want him back if he is their daughter, and he can't be their daughter. He is who he is, and they don't want him as a son. They have no interest in him coming back as a son. They only have an interest in him coming back as a daughter. Nancy, who is our main character through the story, we have some similar issues with her, although not as drastically. Before she left to her portal world, she was very much vibrant. She liked bright colors and, sunshiny child. And now she's very serious. She doesn't like to wear color. She only wears like blacks and grays and whites. And her parents just don't really understand who she is. And they just want their child back. But because of the experiences Nancy has had in her portal world, she can never go back to being who she was before she left. And again, that just really resonated with me as a huge metaphor for growing up. And it could also be a metaphor for other things, like, for instance, people who go through a traumatic event, children who witness a trauma, witness a school shooting, people who go to war, And our soldiers, they leave and come back very changed. Children who are kidnapped and eventually returned home, or who in some other way have terrible traumatic things happen to them, those things change who they are, and they never get back who they were in the beginning. They're never going to be who they were when they disappeared, when they left home. And I think that is so true as an adolescent as well. You're going to go and leave your family. You're going to have life experiences. And then when you come home, you are not going to be who you were. And often that is a struggle for parents and children to come to terms with what that means for their relationship. Similarly, I wanted to talk about this idea of returning home. These children, they lived most of their lives, in most cases, in the real world, the world that they inhabit outside of the portal. They go into this portal, are sucked in, and then change drastically while they're inside. And when they are sent home, home no longer feels like home. Probably more because they're different, sometimes because home's a little different. There are 2 children there who, after they came back, they found out that their parents had had another child to kind of replace them. And they are not able to integrate back into their family because they've been replaced by this other child who didn't even know they existed. And I think that in a lot of ways too is very true of some of the struggles I'm having as an adult, and I'm sure I'm not the only one, of wanting to go home and not really having a place that feels like home anymore. As I mentioned, I moved out when I was 18, and when I was growing up, I viewed the town I grew up in as a small town. It was a small town where the big industry was, there was a factory, and most of the people in my town were kind of working poor. The dads worked at the factories, the moms stayed home. There were other service jobs in the area, but that was heavily how I would have viewed my town if you'd have asked me. My parents both drove an hour away for jobs, professional jobs. And so what we had was a little different, and we ended up being a little more upper class, I would say, than some of our neighbors. A lot of our neighbors who's had one working parent who worked at the factory and the other who didn't work, they had a little more financial struggles. We always had a little more than many of our neighbors. But, that was just how we saw it. It was a working poor town, but very small town-esque. When I moved out, I ended up moving to a bigger city for better job opportunities. And then eventually I moved out of state. And when I was out of state, I desperately wanted to go home. I really struggled. I was married to a soldier, and he was not home a lot, and I was very lonely, and I was very out of my element, and man, I really wanted to go home. And then I did go home after him and I split up, and found that the place that I remembered doesn't really exist anymore. And that was kind of a blow to me, that even though I was home, it didn't feel like home anymore. And the things that I remember, this little quaint small town that I remember, is not where I live now. If you were to ask me my perception of town now, we are a town that has a lot of poverty. We have severe drug problems and homelessness problems, things that I wouldn't have believed of my town growing up. And now I will say, part of the fact that I work in healthcare, I see things that I probably wouldn't have seen as a child. And so I do think that there is a little bit of seeing behind the curtain because of my exposure to it as an adult. But even so, we have tent cities in our town, and I didn't think we had homeless people. Like, that was something the big cities had. We never had homeless people. We had a homeless shelter, and I couldn't imagine anybody needing to stay there. I didn't even know we had one in town until I was 18, and I had just moved out, and a friend of mine got kicked out of her house too, and she asked us to come pick her up at the homeless shelter. Her parents had dropped her at the homeless shelter. And I couldn't believe we had one of those in our town. So this idea from these kids that the place that they are returned to is no longer home, and that they just want to go back home, it just really touched me. And I thought that was an interesting, again, theme for growing up. And for some of the complicated things, the home that you left isn't home anymore. And that desire to go home, and that need to find your home, and that frustration sometimes when you can't find it. I am still looking for my home, and I still haven't found one. So it's been a bit of a struggle. I think those were the main themes I wanted to touch on. I will be interested in, I know one of the children in a future book, because I looked at like whose books the future portal books are. One of the children does get to go back to their portal, and I'm wondering if it will be everything they hoped it would be. And I'm really eager to see if the author continues these themes. And it could be that I'm reading way too much into this and that nobody else got this out of this book. But I was fascinated by it. I wanted to mention it. I had a really interesting time with this book, although it was more thought-provoking than entertaining. So this is Jane. That's about what I have to say. I would love to hear your thoughts on the series. Am I reading way too much into this, or are these valid thoughts? Did you have similar feelings and connections while reading this book? Please leave that in the comments below. If you haven't read the book, I do recommend it. It was a good read. I will be interested to see if the future books, if I connect with them or not, because they're in the portal worlds. And while I like fantasy, I'm not sure. So we'll see how they go. But I am eager to read more in the series, just to see, especially the ones that don't necessarily take place in the past in the portal worlds, or that do take place in the past in the portal worlds and are characters that I really connected to, which so far do not have books. So my social media is below if you would like to connect with me off of YouTube. Also, if you are new to this channel, please hit subscribe for more content. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like. And I wanted to note that in my social media below, there's also links to my author page on Amazon and Smashwords. I write primarily romance, and I have some books in Kindle Unlimited. So if you happen to be a romance reader, particularly with a little bit of fantasy, the romance that I have on Kindle is paranormal historical. So werewolves in Tudor England, Regency England, and the American post-Civil War. So if you are interested in any of those things, check my books out for free on Kindle Unlimited if you are a member. Otherwise, my books are also available on Amazon, and my other books are available on Amazon and Smashwords. Alright guys, this has been Jane. I'll talk to you next time. Bye.